Hello, everyone, and welcome back to War and Literature, English 1120 at the University of Ottawa. I'm Tim Wilson. Tonight, we're going to provide an introduction to Shakespeare's history plays. So we've already had an introduction to Shakespeare's drama in general. Now, more specifically, we're going to look at this history genre, a genre of plays written by Shakespeare that should prepare us well for reading Henry V next week. Without further ado, let's get started. I'll call up the presentation that will guide us as always. And what we want to start with is a sense of reminder. We talked a bit about it last time, but a reminder a bit of this distinction between comedy and tragedy and how history combines a bit of both elements. We'll look at war and history, the theme of this course, but also how it plays such a prominent part in all of the history plays. We'll look at the role of politics and the themes of politics in the history plays, how that is, for the history plays, again, a predominant theme. We'll look at the historical context of when Shakespeare was writing these plays during the Anglo-Spanish War. And we'll talk briefly about historical thinking generally, what that means, and what way and what kind of Shakespearean historical thinking do we detect in the plays themselves. So first off, the question of Shakespeare's histories, just a reminder that there are the histories listed in the first folio of 1623, and they're the English histories, really, we could call them. They're based on the Chronicle histories of Hall and Holinshed, and focus primarily on the problems of succession and the Wars of the Roses, a civil war in England during the 15th century. More broadly, we could add to those English histories certain of the tragedies which deal with Roman history. So we could, although it's not isolated in the first folio as a separate category, when looking at the tragedies, there's a separate category you can pull out called that we could call the Roman histories. And these are all based on the works of Plutarch and deal with the rise and fall of Roman Republic and the beginning of the Roman Empire. Here's a listing in terms of, in the order of the historical material they cover in the play, not the chronological order in which they were written by Shakespeare, but in terms of their subject matter, both of the English histories and the Roman histories. So you see the 4 Roman histories there, and you see there's 10 English histories. So the first one here, King John, and the last one, Henry VIII, stand a little bit on their own. And then the ones in between are often grouped into 2 tetralogies that we'll talk about. There's this first tetralogy, the first one in terms of, well, sorry, it's the second tetralogy in terms of the order of composition, from Richard II to Henry V, and the first tetralogy, it was written first. Henry VI plays 3 of them, and Richard III. So here, if that wasn't clear, here they're grouped in a separate slide. Again, the first tetralogy here, it's in terms of its order of composition, it's the first tetralogy because they were written in the early 1590s, but they deal with historical subject matter that comes after the material here. The second tetralogy ending with Henry V, and obviously Henry VI dealing with historical events after that. So why are these important? So the tetralogies are a later added by critical scholars later as way of grouping these plays. They were not grouped as tetralogies when produced, but scholars said, okay, well, they seem to have sets of 4 in terms of their subject matter. They seem to have a pattern of showing, let us say, a failure on the part of a monarch or rulers that causes the country to go through some civil war, some strife, some negative outcomes, and then there's a sign of redemption at the end. And the theme of interpreting the Tetralogies this way is, and a scholar by the name of Tillyard is one of the most prominent in this regard, really is about seeing Shakespeare's histories plays as demonstrating the view that there's a divine providential design behind the happenings of history. And we'll return to this point when we think about historical thinking generally. But the divine providential design behind the plays would be to see that, beginning with the Richard II play, where we have a weak monarch, Richard II, who's overthrown by Henry Bolingbroke, who becomes Henry IV, and his reign begins to be described in the next two plays. So this divinely anointed king, Richard II, is overthrown, and this is, according to the theory, this should be frowned upon, obviously. And due to that, let's say, political sin, the nation must go through the turmoil of civil war that is a couple of rebellion attempts that are portrayed in Henry IV Part 1 and Part 2. But ultimately, with Henry V, we have a redemption in the form of a wise monarch, a good leader who leads the nation in victorious campaigns in France, culminating in the Battle of Agincourt during the 100 Years' War. However, the sin was not totally expunged. We have another sequence here. We have a weak king again, Henry VI, who, because of that weakness, leads to, again, a series of civil wars called the Wars of the Roses between the House of Lancaster and the House of York. And this is portrayed in these three plays. Richard III is the culmination of this painful period in English history, at least as portrayed in Shakespeare's play, a tyrannical, ruthless ruler, whose rise to power is enabled through machinations, orchestrating the death of children to eliminate potential successors out of the way, and whose rule is finally overcome by the victory of the Henry Tudor, the rise of the Tudor dynasty. And this way of seeing the two tetralogies together would assert that Shakespeare's really portraying a defense of the Tudor dynasty and a defense of the current monarch, Elizabeth I, and what they were managed to accomplish. Now, other scholars, especially in the last couple of decades, have tried to poke holes in this theory that Shakespeare's portraying some sort of divine providential design behind the arrival of Tudor rule and the monarchs of his day. So they would say that looking at these plays, we actually see subtle critiques of Elizabethan rule or of the Tudor establishment. So whether or not we see these as united tetralogies, sets of 4 plays, has a bearing on how we interpret them as, or Shakespeare's message in these plays in relationship to whether it's a critique or tacit support of the government of his own day, but also Shakespeare's, let's say, ultimate views in terms of what is the best rule, what is the best arrangement of humans on the political realm. So what I've tried to do here is, in one slide, is to give you a sense in terms of timeline and ordering of events, both of the contextual events, the historical context, but also of Shakespeare's plays. So which periods are Shakespeare's plays covering, and when did he write them? So in terms of Shakespeare's writing, you see it begins here in the early 1590s, and he writes them. The history plays are written through the course of the 1590s. Predominantly as King Henry VIII was written in the 1613. And the immediate context is, again, this Tudor dynasty lasting between 1485 to 1603 at the death of Elizabeth I. But also, and we'll talk about this briefly, the Anglo-Spanish War from 1585 to 1604. So the context of the writing is in the context of that Anglo-Spanish War. So when he's thinking about war, his immediate experience is of this Anglo-Spanish War. In terms of the historical events that he's treating, he treats everything from the lead up to the Magna Carta, this statement of the freedom of the nobility and the rights of the nobility in relationship to the monarch. Predominantly in these two tetralogies, he deals with events in the 100 Years' War with France, culminating in the Battle of Agincourt, portrayed in Henry V. He deals with the War of the Roses, which took place in this period here. And here are let's say the immediate setting of the plays. So King John in 1210s, second tetralogy. So that's Richard II to Henry V, dealing with this period here between 1398 and 1415. And the first tetralogy, the Henry VI plays, and Richard III dealing with this period, 1422 to 1485. So that gives you a sense of the plays, what periods they deal with, the kind of the historical context of the plays that they're trying to deal that they take as their subject matter. So a reminder of this genre, history as a genre between comedy and tragedy. So the first folio comes out in 1623. Now recall that this is already in Shakespeare's day. This is shortly after his death in 1616. Colleagues, friends, and the general literary public had already realized that he was far and away the best author of the age, maybe one of the best authors of all time. And we'd say that in today's parlance, the GOAT, the greatest of all time, is Shakespeare the GOAT. I hadn't thought of that yet, but that would be a good discussion. So these colleagues said, okay, well, rather than just have these plays exist in various forms, and some of them corrupt forms, some of them, let's say, publications that were produced by someone who's attended the play and tried to write it down afterwards, and they become, let's say, bad copies of the play, bad quartos in the case of Hamlet. Rather than have these various unauthorized copies exist individually, let's have an authorized copy of his collected plays. So there's 36 plays there grouped in these categories of comedies, histories, tragedies in this first folio. And then, being a folio, it's already demonstrating this sense of reverence. Generally, sacred works or revered scholarly manuscripts are produced in this folio form, whereas kind of like a cheap paperback would be your quarto or octavo, and normally plays or that type of thing would have been reserved for quarto or octavos. But by putting them in this folio, they're saying, no, this is warrants the extra expense that you're going to pay for this. It warrants reverence on the library shelf, so to speak. So histories in this, as you can see on the right, this is this table of contents from the first folio, what they call a catalog. So comedies come first, histories next, then the tragedies. So just in terms of the actual placement within the folio, histories are between the two, but also in terms of, I would say, the logic of the genres. So just a reminder, I think we talked about this when we had an introduction to Shakespeare's drama, but we could classify the three genres in relationship to the aspect of soul to which they appeal, the space of their thematics, their moral teaching, and the overriding or decisive image that we're left with at the end. And in each case, we have a part of soul, we have a moral teaching, we have a defining image that is between that of comedy and tragedy. We have the part of soul that is between the desiring aspect and the wisdom-seeking aspect. We have a moral teaching that goes from, let's say, the particular of ruling one's household to let's say the ruling of the entire cosmos, the space between a larger whole, but not the whole beings as a whole. The cosmos is the state. So the political teaching is the human realm that we can digest in our life between the sphere of the family and that of the cosmos. And so too, between the social ordering of love and desire in marriage, to between that and what we get at the end of life and death, we have our political dealings and defined by war. So war is, as we said, and we'll talk about in the next section of the lecture, the defining and punctuating feature of all the history plays. So war and history. So the deciding aspect of all of the history plays is a final battle. So the battle decides the action. So the action has been building up. There we have two opposed forces, two opposed, let's say, leaders, two nobles facing off against one another, a noble trying to usurp a king putting down a rebel noble. In every case, that gesturing, that posturing between the two is settled in a battle. So in tragedies, maybe there is war going on in the background. There is war going on in the background of Hamlet, but the battle is not what decides the action in Hamlet. In Hamlet, what decides the action, the tension of the plot, is the exposure on the part of Hamlet of the plots of Claudius, the battle with Laertes, etc. In history, it is the war. It's the battle that is the deciding feature. However, as I point out here in the second bullet, and as the chorus mentions in Henry V, it's impossible to represent battle or the action of a battle really on a small stage. And the chorus says, "Can this cockpit hold the vasty fields of France?" So what we get in the plays, rather than trying to get thousands of people onto a stage and represent cannon fire and horses, rather than that, what we get are auditory indications that battles are happening just off stage. Okay, so one can be a prominent one is what we see in the text are stage directions telling the director or the producer when staging the play that this part of the play calls for an alarm, which is often modernized, the spelling's often modernized to alarm, which comes from Italian to arms, al armi. So an alarm is a trumpet, drums, bells calling the army to arms to get ready. They're about to engage the enemy. And it's a stage direction we see prevalently in the plays, but by far most prevalently in the history plays. And you see to the right a numbering from the first folio of how often these indications are by genre. So we only get 2 stage directions for alarm in the comedies. We get 14 in the tragedies, and those are really in just a few of the tragedies, not all of them. The Roman histories, we get 22, and then in the English histories, we get the by far the lion's share, 58. So as I mentioned, the comedies, you almost never get a battle indicated, and the one play All's Well That Ends Well is in itself is a peculiar play, is often called a problem comedy. It's the only exception. And even there, the alarm is not an actual battle. It's a ruse to expose this one character for being a coward and being disloyal. So the alarm is just something that was affected by some of the a couple of the other characters in order to bring out this character's cowardice and the fact that he's disloyal. As you see on the right, average number of alarms per play, so if we were to average them across the plays within that genre. So tragedies contain references to war, but the war's directly related to the tragic climax in only a couple. So Macbeth and Troilus and Cressida are the examples. And in only of the 8 tragedies that are not also classified as Roman histories, only the following instances of alarm can be found. So King Lear, a couple, Macbeth and Troilus and Cressida. And as I said, it's really only in Macbeth and Troilus and Cressida where the battle marks kind of the climax of the action. So the death of Macbeth in a battle, in one-on-one combat. Politics and history. So war is prevalent in history plays. So is the thematic generally of the political and what is the proper rule of the regime. I would say all of Shakespeare's plays deal with politics in some way, but the histories deal in a more focused way with the traditional sense of the political. So to quote Alexander Leggett, what is the traditional sense of the political? It would be to quote, the ordering and enforcing the gaining and losing of public power in the state. So the other thing to note here is that Shakespeare is not going to parade abstract principles. So there's not going to be a character or an abstract concept for which they fight that is trumpeted. What we get are individuals and their passions, their reasons, their what they hold dear, and in the dramatic interplay and interaction of these characters, we take away from the holistic design some sort of sense of a message of what Shakespeare may be saying or may not be saying about proper political rule. One thing we could say is that Shakespeare, in showing different types of individuals, is keen to show that different regimes enable different types of individuals to arise. So the regime is a political constitution, but more than just it's a classical concept. So Plato's Republic is a translation, that title, the Republic, is a translation of politeia, which is really this notion of regime. So it's, let's say, constitution, but not just a set of not a set of written rules or anything like that, but what that community, what the political community holds dear, what the political community holds as its ruling values, what it holds as to be valued, what it holds as prohibited. So that's kind of the constituting nature of the political regime, is that politeia is the regime. Now, if we live in a certain type of regime, it's going to be a soil that's fertile to grow certain types of individuals as plants, as soil would a plant. Other types of soil, other types of regime will be a poor soil, will not allow the prospering of certain types of individual. So in his Roman plays, Shakespeare shows the essence of the Roman regime under the form of the Republic and the Empire. So in the Republic, in the early forming of the Republic, he shows this in this play called Coriolanus. Now, Coriolanus, the lead character, is this really martial, spirited individual, honor-seeking individual, an aristocratic warrior who let's say disdains the plebeian masses to some extent. So we see that with the rise of the Roman Republic, the Roman Republic is going to be something that can produce a Coriolanus, honor-seeking individual, aristocratic warrior individual type. But we see in the course of the plot of Coriolanus as play that aspect of the regime needs to be moderated with concern for and give a space to the common laborers, the plebeians. So they are through that play we see the victory of the plebeians in their request for this institution of the tribunate. At the end of the Roman Republic, we see with the play Julius Caesar, the individual as potentially far outpacing his peers in terms of power and foreign conquest, in the case of Julius Caesar, and the tension that can bring about, and how that led to the decline and fall of the Republic as a regime. And with the beginning of the Roman Empire, as portrayed in the Antony and Cleopatra play, we see how that imperial regime can give rise to a release of individual passions, no longer bound to a sense of the common duty. Res publica is Latin for the public things. It's concern for the common things, for the common welfare. So commonwealth is usually another translation in English of the principal ones trying to get across with res publica. So in the English histories, Shakespeare shows English monarchy as a regime that, in order to prosper, must combine those elements of a republic and an empire, must combine the elements of a centralized state, so a kind of an imperial rule under a strong monarch. And what we see on that front is that the history plays show catastrophes always happen when we have a weak monarch. And I've tried to schematize that here in terms of political power on this spectrum. We can have either weak or strong in terms of whether that monarch is employs that, let's say, imperial element that is needed in a monarchy. So we see Henry V is definitely a strong monarch, and examples that we can see in the histories of weak monarchs, Richard II, Henry VI, led to catastrophes, led to usurpation on the part of Richard II, led to incessant civil wars, the loss of French territory on the case of Henry VI. But it's not enough just to have a strong ruler. We can see that a strong ruler that doesn't have at least a seeming concern for the public good also leads to catastrophe. So we can have a strong ruler such as Richard III was definitely a strong ruler, but had no concern for public notions of morality or the good of the common people. So that led to a certain type of tyranny. Henry IV, in a different way, not a tyrant in the sense of Richard III, doesn't show the same concern for public morality, is quite explicit about being Machiavellian, and that has its own limitations in terms of his garnering of the legitimacy with his fellow nobles. So Shakespeare seems to be saying that for the English monarchy to prosper, it needs to combine those two elements that we see as lessons from the Roman histories. We talked a bit in the introduction to Shakespeare about the morality play. We talked about how before this real birth of Renaissance or 16th century drama in England, that had been preceded in the late Middle Ages by mystery plays and morality plays. And these morality plays featured, every man character having to find his or her way through existence, being tempted by vice, being called by virtue, and having to find the right path. So according to some scholars, and notably Irving Ribner, I've cited here at the bottom, the morality play in a way becomes the history play in the course of the 16th century. So if every man represents kind of universal humanity, the history play, the general representative of humanity, is replaced by a nation. So the nation becomes this sense of the main character, and it's the nation struggle as it goes through, kind of being pulled in one direction, being pulled in another, and having to find its way. I'll also note that the English histories, as opposed to the Roman histories, have to deal with another political institution, another political force, that of the Christian church. So with Christianity, as opposed to the religion of the Greeks and Romans, we're dealing with a religion that's universal as opposed to a civic religion. So in a civic religion, it's a religion of the city. So the gods and goddesses of the Greeks, for instance, are those of the city, and maybe another city worships another god and goddess, and maybe they know of those other gods, but they're not held in the highest esteem. They're not part of the rites and traditions of that city. Now, also with a civic religion, the rites and traditions are really part and parcel of being a member of that city. So you're a member of that city, you're a citizen, you're expected to follow those rights. It is on a par with the other prohibitions against murder that city would have, or if the city had another law, it would be part and parcel with those types of civic laws, prohibitions, and sacred standards. A universal religion transcends, well, applies to humanity as a whole, so it's beyond that one city. And as such, the claims of a universal religion are in tension at times with the claims of a civic religion, or civic standards. So to give an example, let's say that's topical for 21st century Canadians, would be let's say the law permitting abortion, or permitting doctor-assisted suicide. These are civic legislation. There's, let's say, they're political enactments that set certain standards for the community. But if someone adheres to the beliefs of certain traditional religions, the religious beliefs and standards could be in tension with those political legislated standards. So if one holds to those traditional religious beliefs, they would be in tension and would hold the religious beliefs to have a higher claim, because they come from a divine revealed source that is beyond that of any particular political institution and any particular political any community. The other difference, so there's that claim, so that adds the fact that Shakespeare is dealing with an organization, an institution that is in tension with the political community, or can be in tension. So what is Shakespeare's view on the relationship of the church and the state, let us say? We will see some of that tension in Henry V for sure, right off the bat. First scene, there's this tension on display. The Christian religion, as opposed to Greek Roman religion, is otherworldly versus thisworldly. So thisworldly, that type of religion, what is valued, what is the actions, rewards for action are in this world. If I'm brave, if I perform my duty, I'm not expecting to direct all of my attention to the fate of my soul in an afterlife. It's because I need to do that for the good of this world and this life now, and the people in this life, maybe my descendants in future generations, but it's in this world that we will see the benefits of virtuous behavior. And otherworldly religion sees really the goal of all of our actions. Our life in this world is about spiritual alignment with a divine that is otherworldly. It is in a spiritual realm. It's to be revealed to us in its finality in another life, in another form of existence. And then the final point would be that goes back to Machiavelli too, is that the Christian church, we could say, cultivated a spirit of humility and obedience versus the independent spirit of the warrior cultivated by the classical religious doctrine. So what does that do to thoughts around politics and what's needed in the political community? If on the one hand we have people who may adhere to beliefs that are in tension with the beliefs of the political community, if they're directed to otherworldly goals as opposed to advancing the goals of this community, and if rather than being fierce warriors willing to die and fight for the community, they've been cultivated in the spirit of humility and obedience. So all that to say, we could say that a dichotomy at work in the political dimensions of Shakespeare's English histories is this tension between what's required of a medieval regime and the modern regime. And I want to claim that Shakespeare's English histories largely chart out the various conflicts at work there, and he follows a certain understanding, I would say, of what was ultimately taught by Machiavelli, the need for the modern ruler to control the influence of the church on the state or political life, to get the subjects to focus on the prosperity in this world for them to be able to advance their communal goals, and to cultivate again the independent spirit of the warrior. And we'll definitely see that in the speeches of Henry V before going into battle, really underscore this last point in particular. So historical context. So I mentioned the Anglo-Spanish War as the immediate political context. So just a word or two about that. So how did this arise? And first of all, it's an intermittent war. It's not, our sense of a kind of an ongoing struggle with two continuous fronts battling all the time. They're separated by an ocean, and so there was kind of intermittent raids on each side. But it did kind of endure these intermittent conflicts for around 19 years. So caused mainly due to, first of all, religious differences, and sometimes I think that's an excuse for other more pressing political power-seeking reasons. Also, piracy on the side of English pirates, privateers they called themselves, such as Hawkins and Drake, where they were actively encouraged by Elizabeth to steal treasure from Spanish shipping from the New World. And then Spain, for its own part, supported Catholic revolts in England, such as the one to replace Elizabeth with Mary, Queen of Scots. Then during the Dutch revolt, so the Dutch Protestants in the Netherlands revolted against Spanish rule, starting in 1572, and right at the beginning, right since the beginning, the English supported that covertly and then overtly beginning in 1585. And a note, for a literary note, the great, the incredible author and prose author and poet, Sir Philip Sidney. So if you haven't read any of his sonnets, Astrophil and Stella, please, I highly recommend you do. I have a short lecture on this on this channel on Elizabethan sonnets featuring Sidney sonnets, if you want to use that to guide you through them. So excellent poet, the Renaissance man, poet, soldier, courtier, who everyone looked up to in this generation of the 1580s and 90s, died in 1586 in the Battle of Zutphen in the Netherlands as part of this conflict. And it's one of those historical situations where we can only say, what if he had been able to live longer. He died at an extremely young age, 30 something, maybe for my undergrad, some of my undergraduate students doesn't seem all that young, but it's really young. He had a lot more productive years left in him, and it's too bad that he died so young, because as I said, he was such an incredible author. So the Spanish Armada. So the Spanish Armada is a real defining action in this Anglo-Spanish War, and one that for the English had this real effect of inspiring nationalism, having this sense of inspiring this sense that they're a divinely ordained nation that was destined to rule the seas and destined to expand their power. And so I want to just mention a little bit about this Spanish Armada. A fleet of 130 ships, by far the largest armada at that point in history, that would set sail from Lisbon under the command of Medina Sidonia. So he had no previous experience of naval command, so strangely appointed by the Spanish monarch to do this and to lead this expedition. On the other side, the English, although vastly outnumbered in terms of their ships, were led by able seamen, including some of these privateers that we were talking about, such as Drake, and who had experience with how to handle their vessels, had faster, more maneuverable vessels. So they're outgunned just in terms of sheer numbers, but were able to go in, fire off a shot, and withdraw out of range before the more cumbersome ships were able to line themselves up for a return volley. They had better shipboard cannon technology, and one reason that, and when people mention the Spanish Armada, people say, "Oh well, it was destroyed by a storm." That was one reason. Towards the end, they had already lost several engagements before then, but that's kind of what gave them the finishing blow towards the end. And was also, for the English at the time, another reason why they felt that this was a divinely aided victory, the fact that the storm came at just the right time. So as I said, it really contributed at this time to this heightened sense of English nationalism. So it was seen when it launched as invincible. They're so vastly outnumbered, and there must have been divine providence behind their victory. God had chosen the English people to win, had chosen them to be prosperous, had chosen the Tudor dynasty to be in rule at that time. So there's a celebration of the English nation, celebration of the English achievement under the Tudors. The political achievement of the Tudors was seen as God's providential salvation from the years of civil war that we talked about, the Wars of the Roses, and from the scourge of Richard III. We have this political solution in the Tudors, and there's also a religious solution that the Tudors affected, that being charting out via media, a middle way between the extremism of Protestant that you would see in Northern Europe, Protestant reaction against Roman Catholicism in terms of destroying all ecclesiastical structures and traditional rituals and beliefs, and adhering strictly to Rome on all matters. So they tried to affect a via media between those, and we also, as I said, on the political realm, had a compromise between or seemingly a compromise between the houses of York and Lancaster in the Tudors. So what also fed into this nationalism were some chronicle history. So in the 16th century, there's a resurgent sense of trying to articulate the history of the nation, and notably these chronicle histories, Edward Hall and Raphael Holinshed in the mid part of the century, and had written chronicles that were directly influential for Shakespeare. He had certainly read them. At this period too of the 1590s, during this Anglo-Spanish War, there were also a real proliferation of books on military tactics and doctrine, and we see echoes of that in Henry V. We see echoes of the fact that these are prevalent books that people are reading and probably pontificating about in pubs and sounding like they're experts in military doctrine because they've read one book. And we see something like that with Llewellyn is concerned about the siege mines in Act 3, Scene 3, and how they're not being consistent with what he calls the disciplines of the war, and we see a lot from that from Llewellyn. Also, Llewellyn is sometimes the name Llewellyn is sometimes a modernization of Fluellen, as you may have in your version of that. I want to close off with this thought on historical thinking. So Shakespeare's writing these histories, and so history as a genre and as a way of even thinking about the past or the future or the present. What is history? First of all, history as a mode of writing or thinking really began with figures such as Herodotus and Thucydides in ancient Greece, and this is in the fifth century before the Common Era. And we see on the right the Herodotus, the histories, probably the first work of pure history. So the first, the word history comes from the Greek historia. So I've sometimes seen in gender studies or works on feminist history the call to replace the word history with her story, but that's assuming a false etymology of the word history. So it's not is story. It's from a Greek word historia, which means inquiry. So these first histories then are inquiries into the past and its causes. Okay, so it's happening at the same time as the birth of philosophy, which and the first philosophers are really, we have to kind of remind ourselves what they're talking about. They were talking about the natural world. They're really, the first philosophers are natural philosophers. They're natural scientists. They're looking at the natural world and they're saying, okay, well, maybe everything consists of water. So if I recall correctly, that was Thales' proposition that all is water. So to say, okay, well, everything's definable by this element and it causes other phenomena. So with later philosophers, beginning with Socrates, it was said that Socrates brought philosophy down to the city and to talk about the human things. So later philosophies would also say, okay, well, let's talk about the realm of causes when it comes to, let's say, our virtues and political actions. So what is justice? What is this? And what are the causes of that? Okay, so history belongs in that first beginning of the philosophical inquiry into causes, both in terms of the natural world and then in terms of the human things. And history, in a way, was the first turning to causes in the realm of the human things, of human actions. What were in the past, what were those causes? So kind of one of the first, let's say, social science or humanity disciplines. So the central idea in the histories, as opposed to maybe how we think of history, is that in looking at the past and its causes, we're going to learn about the present and the future, that there are eternal truths to be learned from this inquiry into the past. It's not, well, and that separates it from, let's say, current conceptions of history in a couple of ways. One is, it's not an objective or disinterested curiosity. It's just, well, I'm just curious what happened in that war. Oh, that's kind of interesting. It's because it's a lesson about the present and about what's going to happen to you. It's inquiring to the past. We're learning about ourselves, and it's because there are these timeless truths that still affect us. That's, let's say, distinct from our own sense of history in another way, in that for the last couple hundred years, under the sway of historicism and maybe now more of a relativistic historicism, we in the 20th and 21st century, we think of each epoch or each era having its own defining features, and that what we learn from the past is not something that we can apply to the present necessarily, that we've maybe progressed beyond that, or we have different situation that governs, let's say, or causes us to behave, and our beliefs to be different, our values to be different, and that's incommensurable with the values of the past, and thus no definitive conclusions about how we should behave in the present should be drawn therefrom. History and universal. So the historians claim that they were presenting universal truths, but Aristotle wanted to highlight that they in some ways were removed from the universal categories, and we're presenting them as clearly, let us say, as philosophers. So he says, okay, well, let's separate philosophers and poets and historians in relationship to universal truths. Now, he says philosophers deal only with universal truths. So I'm going to deal with, let's say, for Aristotelian, I'm going to deal with the theory of substance, and what is substance, and what are the metaphysical questions and categories that arise from thinking about the substance of things. And the poet deals with universals, but is able to figure them forth into a poetic image. So the poet is close to the philosopher because they're able to present universals. They don't do so directly, but through poetic images, but in a way that's useful, because by figuring them forth, it can be a way to show them to the many, so to speak, and to encourage others to follow. Let's say if the universal that's being presented is a human virtue, then it can be a way of encouraging the audience to follow that virtue. History for Aristotle is tied to particular occurrences, and it has to record those particular occurrences, and is, for Aristotle, is the least universal, least philosophical, let us say, of them. Now, again, the historians themselves felt that they were looking to the universal, but drawing from it looking at the particular, but drawing from it a universal. So according to the, let's say, the Aristotelian categories, we could say that Shakespeare creates a new kind of poetic history that looks at historical particulars, but by adding to them and shaping them poetically, tries to bring forth universal truths as well. Now, a final note on two basic modes of thinking about history. And these two basic modes of thinking about history are connected to what we talked about when we talked about the medieval synthesis, and we talked about the synthesis of Athens and Jerusalem, of the Greco-Roman classical tradition and the Judeo-Christian tradition. What we're dealing with there also are two notions of history. So the Greco-Roman notion of history was had a certain conception of the cosmos as eternal, as existing for all time, and events that happen in the cosmos happen in a cycle which perpetuates and continues this eternal ongoing flow of time that doesn't really present anything new for us. Time flows in a circle, as I note here, just as in the Homeric conception of the cosmos, the ocean, the river ocean flows around the earth. Now, the Christian view of history is building on the Hebrew is in a way the opposite. The cosmos has a beginning and an end. God acts in history, so things happen in history that might not be predicted. and it's linear. It's going to have a beginning and end, and that historical development is under the purview of God and has a certain design and follows God's will, not necessarily just a cosmic circular pattern. So if we accept the Shakespearean tetralogy view, if we accept the Tillyardian view that Shakespeare wrote the tetralogies, the 4 plays, as sets to demonstrate this notion that there was a kind of an original political sin, a fall, and that there's a redemption and a restoration with God, that could be seen as, let's say, Shakespeare following within a certain type of the Christian notion of history as both providential, as being ordered by divine will, and as being linear, as going from kind of a fall through events to an eventual redemption at the end. In as much as we see Shakespeare's histories, and this is very much the case for someone such as Samuel Johnson in the 18th century, if we see Shakespeare's histories as presenting timeless truths about human nature, then we are appealing primarily to this Greco-Roman notion of history as demonstrating universal truths that are timeless, and that from which we can learn, but not necessarily having some sort of divine providential linear development behind them. So those two, let's say, basic polarities of conceptions of histories could be working at Shakespeare. Maybe they're both working at the same time. Maybe there's a mixture. I leave it to you when you read it. But they do inform how we interpret the history plays in relationship to some of these questions, both political questions, questions of the ultimate, let's say, message for how one should live their life, how message in terms of our whether or not we should be pious religiously, what have you. With that, I want to close. I hope that's been a useful introduction to Shakespeare's history plays. And next week, we're going to begin the first of a few lectures on Henry V. So I'm looking forward to that, and I'll see you then. Thanks. Bye.